"73 years ago, tomorrow morning, the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. The Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. The Gemara says, "U'bo'a Hashemesh v'zarach Hashemesh." The Gemara brings a pasuk, "U'bo'a Hashemesh v'zarach Hashemesh." And the Gemara interprets this pasuk to mean, quote, "Ad shaloi shaka shimshei shel zeh, hischi lohor shimshei shel zeh." Before the sun of one completely sets, the sun of the second begins to rise. And the Gemara gives examples from Tanoim and Ameroim to prove that the Jewish people are never without a Rebbe, without a leader. Then there's another Gemara which says exactly the opposite. The Gemara says, "Ein malchus negas bechaveta afilu kamalei nima afilu kachut hashayra," which means there's a king, and then there's a second king. There's ein shnei malachim b'shtamshim v'ketzer echad. There's no such thing as two kings sharing one crown. Until the first king's kingship isn't over, the second king's kingship doesn't begin. So you have two different Mamar Chazal. One Mamar Chazal says we're never without a king. The other Mamar Chazal says there's no overlap. The second kings begins at the moment of the passing, at the moment of the histalkus of the king that came before. These are Gemaras. Huh? Okay, what I told you last week was last week, now is today. If you want to ask me a question about contradictions, Thursday night is Q&A, we can bring about it. But right now is Yud Shvat. Okay, so the Gemara says that that there is always a Rebbe. The Rebbe RaYaTz passed away approximately 10 minutes to 8, Shabbos morning, Yud Shvat. And in some spiritual and mystical level at that moment, the Rebbe became Rebbe. Now, of course, the Rebbe wouldn't acknowledge that, and the Rebbe wouldn't approve of that, and the Rebbe was hoping it would never happen. But like many things in life, we don't necessarily have choices. The Rebbe was destined to be a Rebbe. I heard from one of my mashpiyim, he used to say the name of his mashpiyim, "A Rebbe is nicht a geworene Zach, es ist a geborene Zach." A Rebbe is not someone that happens because there's a vacancy, because there's an availability, because there's an empty chair. A Rebbe is born. If you're not born a Rebbe, you're just not the Rebbe material. It's not like you have a chair and there's no one sitting here, so you plop the next best guy down. A Rebbe is a geborene Zach, nicht a geworene Zach. Either you are a Rebbe or you aren't a Rebbe. And the Rebbe is a Rebbe. So the moment of the stalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe, on some level, the Rebbe became a Rebbe immediately, right away. But of course, the way the story plays out, that's not what happened. The Rebbe went through a lot of stuff between that and the official becoming a Rebbe. First of all, on some level, it was personal. The Rebbe himself had to struggle with this idea. There's a story with a Yid who had a Rosh Yeshiva, whose name was Abdavad al-Rikir. Abdavad al-Rikir was a Kotzker Chassid, and the Kotzker Rebbe passed away without any children in 1937, right before the Holocaust. So the Kotzker Chassidim came to Abdavad al-Rikir and said, maybe you should become the next Kotzker Rebbe. So he went into the Frierdiker Lubavitch Rebbe. He worked in Lubavitch, and he told the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Kotzker Chassidim wanted to be a Rebbe. What does the Rebbe think? And the Rebbe said to him, quote, "As Chassidim beten is a simen as a do epis." If Chassidim are asking you to be a Rebbe, that's itself proof that there's something to talk about. And then the Rebbe added, "Nor das a reisteruf and darf sich ibekehren de kishkes in boich." To call this out, your intestines have to turn inside out. And then the Rebbe, the RaYaTz, gave him a whole seder avodah, what he should do before he accepts to become a Rebbe. So Rabbi Hendel learned by the Rebbe in Poland. So when the Rebbe didn't want to be a Rebbe, so he went over to the Rebbe. He came from Montreal to New York, and he went into the Rebbe. He says to the Rebbe, "I know that you're supposed to be a Rebbe." The Rebbe says, "How do you know?" He says, "I know because Reb David wanted, the Chassidim of the Kotzk wanted Reb David to become a Rebbe, and he didn't want. So he came to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe told him, as Chassidim beten is a similar stuff. If Chassidim are asking you something to talk about. But he didn't tell the Rebbe the other half, to call the Satya Kishka turn inside out. So when he told this to the Rebbe, he said, "Our Rebbe," that the Frierdiker Rebbe said, if Chassidim are asking, it's a raya that there's something to talk about, the Rebbe says to him, maybe the Rebbe said something else, maybe he said something else. And of course the other part is that to become a Rebbe, your kishkas have to turn inside out, which he didn't want to tell the Rebbe. So apparently there's some kind of a process with the Rebbe himself. And then of course, you have to put yourself on mute, please. The other part of it is us. One of the realities of the Rebbe is Chassidim. Or as the Rebbe said many times, Chassidim make a Rebbe. Chassidim make a Rebbe. As weird as it is, and even though oftentimes Rebbes are dynasties, that means to say, it's father to son because of genealogy and so on. Chassidim make a Rebbe. Chassidim make a Rebbe. I know more than one story outside of Chabad where the Rebbe was asked to intervene in certain situations, and the Rebbe said, Chassidim make a Rebbe. And I believe that there is an oimek to this. These words, Chassidim make a Rebbe, means that in order for the Rebbe to be a Rebbe, the Chassidim have to make themselves into his Chassidim, and that's how they make him a Rebbe. It's not just that the Chassidim choose a Rebbe, the Chassidim choose a Rebbe by making themselves into his Chassidim, and that takes time. So there was a period of time, not only because the Rebbe Kvayochel was going through whatever he was going through to turn his kishkis inside out, but from our end, from Chassidim's end, it was very important that Chassidim should make themselves into his Chassidim, and from that position, make the Rebbe into a Rebbe. So that also took time. And then of course the third part of this is the unpleasantness. There was some machlokes. There's two ways to look at machlokes. Machlokes is a terrible thing. But one of the things that the Gemara says about a king is that ein meshchin melech ben melech. If a kohen gadol dies, when a kohen gadol becomes a kohen gadol, they put the oil of the Shabbat HaMishcha on his head in a special way. When the kohen gadol passes away, they choose another kohen gadol. Even if the second kohen gadol is his own son, they put the Shabbat HaMishcha oil on his head. When they put the oil of Shabbat HaMishcha on a king's head, and it was only Malchi Beis David. The kings of Yisrael didn't have Malchi Shabbat HaMishcha. They had something called Shabbat HaParsamayim, Keren and Pach. But the kings of David HaMelech, they used the holy oil that was used to anoint the king. God was used to anoint the king of David. If a king of David passes away and his son succeeds him, ein moshein melech, they do not put embalming oil on the son. It's automatic. So you can have a father, a son, a grandson, a great grandson. They will moshech just one, except one case. If a father passes away, a king, and his son who's right to be the king after him needs to become the king, and there's a machlokes, so mipnei hamachlokes, the Rambam brings it, yeah. When there's a machlokes, so when there's a politics, when there's another opinion, there's another candidate, then you're moshech hamelech melech. So the machlokes has a mile, right? The fact that when the Rebbe had to become Rebbe, there was politics, adds that the Rebbe's melucha is a new Mashiach, even though he's following the Frierdiker Rebbe. Chachafilu, he's only a son-in-law and not a son. But the mepnei hamachlokes, so you're moshein melech ben melech. That's a third factor. So the point is this: the Rebbe became a Rebbe the moment the Frierdiker passed away. There's no question about it. And there are people who will tell you the stories. The Rebbe started to perform miracles immediately. The Rebbe started to perform miracles immediately. The Rebbe started to show leadership and paternity, fatherliness, as soon as the Rebbe RaYaTz was nostalgic. But I just gave you three processes: the process for the Rebbe himself, the process for the Chassidim themselves, and the process that has to do with mipnei hamachlokes. I just want to tell you one story, which I feel is a very important story. Historically, it's an important story. And that is that the Chassidim pretty early on realized that the Rebbe is the Rebbe, all of them, at least the vast majority of the Chassidim. And they spent an entire year figuring out how they could convince the Rebbe to accept the position. And the Chassidim knew that the Rebbe is a very, very earnest man. And the Rebbe doesn't say things for effect. He doesn't say things to be dramatic. He doesn't say things for manipulation purposes. He says what he means and he means what he says. And when the Rebbe said, I don't want to be a Rebbe, or like the first quote that I heard, if you're not going to leave me alone, I'm going to run away from New York and I'm going to hide and you'll never find me. The Chassidim took that dead serious. So there were serious meetings of the leaders of Lubavitch, and I mean the leaders of Lubavitch in the holy sense of the word, to come up with tactic how they could push the Rebbe towards Nesiyus without turning him off. It should happen. And it took almost a year. And one of the tactics was that they wrote letters overseas and they said to the Chassidim in other places, it's easier for you than for us because we're here where there's a whole tumult, there's two different teams. And from overseas it's easier to push. And they did, from Eretz Yisrael, from Europe, and wherever Lubavitch Chassidim were in the world, they started writing letters. But finally the Chassidim ran out of patience. 16 days or 15 days before Yud Shvat, Chassidim put it out in the paper that they're accepting the Rebbe as a Rebbe. Finished. They just did it. Now, I promise you that was thought through very carefully by not only great Chassidim, but Chassidim who had a lot of seichel. And it was a tactic. It was a push. And they knew that after the push, there's going to be a pull. You go forward, you go backwards. They made the decision that they're going to put an ad in the paper officially announcing that they're making the Rebbe into the Rebbe. Now, it would have been okay, but somebody grabbed this newspaper, ran into the Rebbe, screaming at the Rebbe, because this person didn't want the Rebbe to be a Rebbe. And he said, look, the Chassidim put in the paper that you're going to be a Rebbe. So the Rebbe called in his secretary, Rabbi Chadakov, and said, you have to put in a denial. This is not true. I never agreed to be a Rebbe. Rabbi Chadakov was a Yekesh Yekim. He was going to do his job. Rabbi Chadakov followed the Rebbe blindly. Whatever the Rebbe wanted to do, he did. But Rabbi Chadakov was also a real chassid. And Rabbi Chadakov desperately wanted the Rebbe to become a Rebbe. So he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. His job required him to put in the denial. His heart didn't allow him to put in the denial. So he went into Reb Shmuel. Reb Shmuel lived in 770, Shmuel Levittin. And he said to Reb Shmuel, I want you to know the Rebbe told me I have to put in Akasha, and I'm going to do it because it's my job. You have 3 hours to change the Ramash's mind. So they ran into the Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, Rabbi Kazanovsky, whoever was in 770, middle of the afternoon, I imagine. Rabbi Kazanovsky started to cry and to scream. Reb Shmuel, who was the mastermind, but Reb Shmuel was an incredibly shrewd man. And he had this ability to intuit. He always knew the right thing the first time. And Reb Shmuel probably was behind that ad. And Reb Shmuel says to the Rebbe, how could you put a denial? We didn't write that you agreed. We wrote that we made you Rebbe. We wrote that we accepted you as Rebbe. You can say you didn't agree, but you cannot deny. We didn't write in the article that you agreed to be Rebbe. We simply wrote the article that we're making. We, as far as we're concerned, you're the Rebbe. So how the story happened, there's a lot of fog. There's a lot of unclarity, lack of clarity about what happened. It was a whole thing. They went to the Rebbe's room and they begged and they pleaded and they talked and they cried and whatever they had to do. The bottom line is, the denial was not put in. Rabbi Chadakov was told by the Rebbe to leave it, not to put in the denial. This is a very, very critical moment from what's explained to me in the process by which the Rebbe became a Rebbe. And the way I understand it, and again, I've been told this by people older and wiser than I, as much as you could say this about a man with a will as strong as the Rebbe's will. The Rebbe's will is steel. Steel, platinum. It's so strong, you have no idea. It's titanium. This is the closest thing to the idea that Chassidim changed the Rebbe's mind. The Rebbe said no, and the Chassidim said yes. The Rebbe said no, the Chassidim said yes, and the Rebbe said no, and the Chassidim said yes, and the Rebbe said no, and the Chassidim said yes, and the Rebbe said okay. In a certain level, in a certain way, that year of agony, where the elder Chassidim, the older Chassidim, the truth of the matter is the older Chassidim were not so worried about themselves. The older Chassidim worried about the younger Chassidim and the future of Lubavitch and the work of the Frierdiker Rebbe. They pushed and they pushed and they pushed, and of course the younger Chassidim did what the younger Chassidim do. The middle Chassidim do what the middle Chassidim do. They made sure the Rebbe should become a Rebbe. And therefore Chadal Tevis, this date, is significant in the story of the Rebbe becoming the Rebbe. But within a week, by the Shvat, it was almost official. The Rebbe wrote a letter, which is very Rebbish. It's written like a Rebbe writes, telling Chassidim to keep the Minhagim of Yartzeit. The Rebbe wrote all the list of Minhagim of Yartzeit. And when it came close, Shvat was Wednesday, like it is this year. In the beginning of that week, there was already official ads in the paper saying that on Wednesday morning, there's going to be the minyan of Kvei Kedush Admor Haramash Shlita. You can see the papers. And then after davening, the whole oilam is going to go to the oihel with specially prepared buses. And then at 8:30 at night, there's going to be a fabrengen with Kvei Kedush Admor Haramash Shlita. And these ads were put in by Merkez. I mean, these ads were put in by Chadakov, by the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe didn't write the word Kvei Kedush Admor Shlita. In the Rebbe Siches, when it ever had to say Kvei Kedush Admor Shlita, the Rebbe would leave dots. He wouldn't write Kvei Kedush Admor Shlita. But he left the space for us to fill it in. That's how it was all the years. And it became official. And then on Yud Shvat, Tavshin Yud Aleph, was a Wednesday night. The Rebbe was supposed to come at 8:30. He showed up at 9:20. And it wasn't because he got cold feet. He was talking to his mother, and every Jew in the world would wish to be a fly on the wall to hear what that conversation was. The Rebbe's mother and the Rebbe talked. It must have been the most important things in the world. My imagination is that she had messages for the Rebbe from Rebbe RaYaTz. from the Rebbe's father. He came to the Fabrengen, and he Fabrengt. And he said, the Rebbe once said that the saying of a Maimer Chassidus by a Rebbe represents another formal stage in the evolution of the Rebbeship. And the Rebbe gave us an example, the Rebbe RaShBI. The Rebbe RaShBI's father passed away 2 days before Sukkot, Yud Gimel Tishrei. Shabbos Chalamet Sukkot, within 7 days, the Rebbe RaShBI said, Maimer Keser Yitnu L'cha, and it's marked in a way as the beginning of the Nesiyus of the Rebbe RaShBI, although the Rebbe RaShBI took 10 or 11 years to fully take on the position of Rebbe. So the Rebbe says the saying of a Maimer Chassidus is, it marks a real substantial step in the what we call the revelation of the Rebbeship. Because the Rebbeship happens at the moment of Histalkus. Actually, the moment one Rebbe passed, the second Rebbe immediately assumes the throne. But in a formal way, the saying of a Maimer Chassidus is substantial in establishing the Rebbe as a Rebbe. So Yud Shvat in 1950, the Rebbe RaYaTz passed away. The Rebbe becomes a Rebbe. 1 year after that, the Rebbe assumes the Rebbeship officially, and the Rebbe changed. When the Rebbe became the Rebbe, he acted like a Rebbe. He put on a kapote. Until then, he was wearing a short jacket, and his relationship to Chassidim changed. He took pedyonis. He allowed people to call him Rebbe. The Rebbe, he was acting as the son-in-law of the Frierdiker Rebbe, right behind the table, doing the work of Merkez. The Rebbe had jobs, and he continued doing those jobs, Merkez and Machane Yisrael. Part of his job was to concern himself with the good well-being of Chassidim, but he was doing it as a Rebbe, as an Eidim, as his son-in-law, not as the Rebbe. And now it became his job. Meaning, the first year, all the Rebbe talked about was the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe is still the Rebbe. Once the Rebbe became Rebbe, that talk was diminished exponentially. It became very rare. The Rebbe talked about, in every Fabrengen, before the official Kabbalah, so to see us, all the Rebbe talked about was the Frierdiker Rebbe. Once it was official, the Rebbe talked about that very infrequently. He did his job. He said Maimorim, he said Sichos, and he started to do, the work of what we call today, rather firmly, with an established, as if it's a fact, the 7th generation, RaShBI. This is the story. The Rebbe becomes the Rebbe, Yud Shvat. So I want to share this with you. I heard from people who heard from people. It's strange to say that something that happened so recently, I have to hear from people, because it was only 70 years ago. I heard from people who heard from people that the Fabrengen finished around 12:30 at night, on Wednesday night. So first of all, Rabbi Khan, he was 21 years old. Between Wednesday night and Shabbos, Chazed the Maimer 20 times. People walked in, he reviewed the Maimer. The Maimer is pretty long. Let's say it's half an hour. He just reviewed the whole Maimer. People walked in, he would Chazed the Maimer. When Shabbos came, Rabbi had repeated the Maimer I don't know how many times. And when the Rebbe came Friday night to Shul, the Rebbe said, quote, Favos de gute Sachen sagt mir nicht. Why didn't tell me anybody the good news that he repeated the Maimer so many times? Yes, sir.
At what point did you ever start wearing kapote on every day?
Yurav, Shvat, Tavshin, Yurav.
About the Fabrengen, were you wearing one?
Before?
Yeah.
No. But Frierdiker Rebbe, I don't know how he did it, but for Shloshim he wore a kapote. But after Shloshim, he kept the black hat instead of the gray hat or the blue hat, but he went back to the suits, and it made Chassidim crazy.
But after the Fabrengen, he was wearing a jacket or bringing you Shvat.
He came with a talk, of course. Yeah, sure. It probably was a silk kapote, I'm going to guess. But the part that I want to tell you, guys, is that it's 12:30 at night. 770 was so packed you couldn't put a spindle in. You couldn't know him for a toothpick. The Rebbe walked out. I don't know who left and who stayed. But someone described to me old men, a lot older than the Rebbe. The Rebbe was not yet 50. Jumping up and down like schoolboys. The joy that they had, the happiness that there was by Chassidim. When the Rebbe became a Rebbe, it was extraordinary. They were just so thrilled. I mean, in a cultural sense, that there is a continuity, that there's a hamshich, it's going to continue. But in a practical sense, that the Rebbe is Rebbe. We have a Rebbe, and it's him. The people, old men, were mamish jumping up and down like schoolboys. The joy was unbelievable. That's one side of it. And the other side of it is that you need to understand that you're dealing with kids who are basically American. Americans loved Joe DiMaggio. They loved I should know this. Mickey Mantle, that's what they loved. Okay, they didn't love Rebbes. This was not their business. The Europeans had not really arrived, and the Europeans came very, very slowly. The young boys and girls, even before the Rebbe passed, Friedrich Rebbe passed, but after the Rebbe passed, as the Rebbe went through this year of transition, they were drawn to him like a magnet, like a magnet. Kids just fell in love with him. They just absolutely adored and loved this man. And they stood around him and ate every word out of his mouth, and they, whatever they could do that would make him happy, made them happy. And he was a big, big tzaddik who wasn't playing baseball, you understand? He wasn't winning any games. He was a Rebbe. And kids, American kids, who you would think would find nothing in common with a man of such holiness, were drawn to him like a metal is drawn to a magnet. There was an old chassid wrote a letter. He said, I don't understand why, but the boys and the girls are running around them like flies are chasing a bulb. There was a magnetism to the Rebbe from young American boys and girls. The Rebbe had a koyach. People were drawn to him. And the Rebbe's being a Rebbe, you can ask people in that generation, it made you so proud. It was so cool that your Rebbe was the Rebbe. He was just such a wonderful Rebbe. There was an incredible amount of happiness around the Rebbe's becoming a Rebbe. And I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this for a moment, because this is something that you need to consider for yourselves, okay? What do simple people have in common with holy people? Nothing. And the holier the person, the less you have in common with them. It's the way it works, right? If you went into a yeshiva, and there's a Rosh Yeshiva who knows the whole Shas, and when he gives a shiur, the Shas is flying around. There's about 6 guys who understand him. So you say, wow, he's a smart guy. He's amazing, right? But what do you and him have in common? What kind of relationship can there be between you and him? Now, if you're very smart, and you know half a Shas, so you would benefit from hearing a shiur from such a person. But if you're a regular person, a simple person, you don't have, you can respect such a person. But what draws you to such a person? The rule is that somebody that you cannot relate to, you have no relationship with. But there's a weird exception to this rule. There's a weird exception to this rule. And the weird exception to this rule is that the holiest of the holiest, the biggest tzaddikim, for some reason, even the lowliest of the lowest feel connected to. You know what they say in Europe? You know what the proof that you were a big Rebbe was? In Poland, there were many Rebbes, yeah? You know what the proof that you were a big Rebbe? That you had shkutzim. You know what shkutzim means? A terror brigade. Guys who were frei wie de Nacht. They did a cold over usher, but if you would dare say one bad word about the Rebbe, they'd club you up into 47 pieces. The greatest Rebbes, the trademark of the greatest Rebbes, was the had Chassidim who were, in terms of doing what the Rebbe said, very poor. But in terms of feeling the love for the Rebbe, very rich. For some reason, the holiest people in the world have the broadest appeal. The best example, I think the best example bar none, is Rabbi Achei. Rabbi Achei passed away 1,800 years ago. Rabbi Achei wrote the Zohar. Okay, do you know what the Zohar looks like? You know how to read the Zohar? How much Zohar do you understand? But everybody has Lag Ba'omer. And we celebrate it. It's not just a day off and marshmallows. We actually celebrate Lag Ba'omer. We make fires and we don't say Tachanun and we sing and dance. We make a whole thing. We go to the fields and we relate to RaShBI. What do you and I have in common with Rabbi Achei? Even people who are on some level of learning, some level of scholarship, if you understand a little bit who Rabbi Achei is, you appreciate that none of us have anything in common with him. And yet, everybody relates to RaShBI. Why? Because the Jews who were the holiest of the holy, somehow you didn't have to be able to relate to them to relate to them. And that's the story of the Rebbe. That's the story of our Rebbe. That's the story of the Rebbe. The Rebbe's The Rebbe's holiness is unbelievable. The Rebbe's genius. The Rebbe's genius. The Rebbe's brain. The Rebbe's brain. The smartest people in the world met the Rebbe and they didn't know his head doesn't explode. How much he knows and how deeply he understands, and everything is so collected, so cool, so calm. The Rebbe's greatness in so many ways, each one of those greatnesses makes him greater than anybody else. You combine all the different eras, the greatness of the Rebbe, you're dealing with a Superman. And everybody felt close to him. Everybody felt like he's theirs and they're his. It wasn't only because he made them feel that way, it's how they felt about him. The Rebbe made people feel unbelievably comfortable. There are 1,000 stories of people waiting outside the Rebbe's room to go into Yechidus and thinking to themselves, I'm such a nervous wreck, I'm not going to hear a word that Rebbe tells me. They walked into the Rebbe, they walked through the door, the Rebbe gave them a smile, and they so relaxed that they felt like they're sitting in the room with their father having a schmooze in an afternoon. The Rebbe's ability to make people comfortable, to make people feel embraced by him was extraordinary. That's from the Rebbe's end. But from our end, the sense that we had of this is my Rebbe, and this is good. I'm proud to be his chassid, and I want to make him happy. Even though we may have been considerably compromised in all kinds of ways, is really something very special. The Rebbe's greatness is not that there are big chassidim who learn his maimorim. The Rebbe's greatness is not that there are big lomdim who learn his shiurim, his siches. The Rebbe's greatness is that every Jew in the world relates to him as if he's theirs. They have nothing in common with him. And somehow the Rebbe skips all the stops. You don't need any preparation to have a relation. I have a brother who's a shliach in a city where there's no Reform temple. There's no Reform temple. That's how religious the Jews in the town are. Not that they're all going to Orthodox. There's no synagogue at all. My brother rolls into town. He's the first religious presence in town. And he's doing stuff. And people are coming. And one of the things that was very important to him was to make videos of the Rebbe. But he wrote to me, he said to us, to my siblings, I'm afraid these people have no sense. They're not going to show him kippur. How are they going to relate to the old man with the white beard who talks Yiddish in a monotone? And the Rebbe, an old man with a white beard talking Yiddish monotone, those are all facts. He's an old man, he has a white beard, he talks Yiddish, he talks in a monotone. The Rebbe didn't swing his hands and make himself look exciting and dramatic, and the Rebbe didn't entertain. He spoke like Moses from the mountaintop. And he's saying, how am I going to put on a video for these people and not turn them off? Well, he did it. And they couldn't get enough. They said, when are you doing it next? When are you doing it next? The reaction of the Balabatim was so surprising to him. And the only explanation is, as they say in Yiddish, this is a soul conversation. They didn't understand the word that I was saying. They understood the subtitles. But sitting and looking at the Rebbe, not at a translation of the Rebbe, not a translator of the Rebbe, a commentator, listening to the Rebbe, everybody somehow relates to this person directly. Because his holiness is so great that it extends so low that every person, including we, who didn't know him, have a deep sense of belonging and connection to the Rebbe. The Rebbe makes every person, one psychologist once told me, the Rebbe made sure everybody felt noticed, which is an interesting thing. The Rebbe, there was thousands of people, and the Rebbe looked at each person and gave that person what they needed. The people that nobody paid attention to, the Rebbe let them know with his eyes or with his body language, I know you're here. He lifted every one of us, and we all relate to him. So today is the day of relationships. Today is Shvat. Shvat is the day the Chassidim get together and they talk about the Rebbe. But I have a secret for you. Anytime Chassidim talk about the Rebbe, and the same is true anytime Chassidim talk about the Eibishter, they're not talking about the Rebbe, they're not talking about the Eibishter, they're talking about themselves. When we talk about the Rebbe, we're interested in the Rebbe, we're interested in what the Rebbe means to me. When we talk about the Eibishter, we're interested in the Eibishter as a philosophy. We're interested in what the Eibishter means to me. Shvat is a day connected to the Rebbe. That means a day connected to our connection to the Rebbe. Now you guys are young. And his kashrus ultimately is a choice. The idea of being a chassid and having a Rebbe is a choice. Especially under the conditions as they are right now. And it's a process that you go through. When you're a little kid, your father brainwashes you, your mother brainwashes you, your school brainwashes you, so you're a Lubavitcher. Then you become a teenager, and some of them remain brainwashed, and some of them question it, they think about it, they doubt it, what's going on, what does it mean, and what does it mean to me, and why is it more important, and why do I have to do it? They have 1,001 different ways of making the same question. The answer ultimately is, at some point, each human being, if he or she is going to be a chassid of the Rebbe, he or she is going to choose it. And that's what this is. Today is Shvat. Shvat, each person, myself included, and you included, and everybody included, assesses what the Rebbe means to me, and on some level recommits themselves to be Chassidim of the Rebbe. All the Rebbe wanted that we should be more Jewish. That's all he wants. And for this he gives brachas, and he gives love, and he gives self-esteem, and he gives no anxiety, he takes away depression. We should just be more Jewish. I spoke last summer to a group of people about oil. These were Pisfardim, and they all came with laundry lists of requests for the Rebbe. Every one of them had a whole list of things they wanted from the Rebbe. And before they went into the oil, I fabrang with them. And I gave them, I didn't give them this spiel, I gave them a different spiel. When I talked to them, it's not important what I said to them. But the substance of my drasha is, you came here not because the oil is a historic landmark in New York City. You didn't come to the oil because people visit special places. This is one of the special places you visit. You came here because over here there's life. The Rebbe is living. And coming to the oil is relating to a living Rebbe. And getting brachas from a living Rebbe. People come to the oil for one reason, people. Because it works. You come with a problem, you leave a note, and he solves the problem. Now, it doesn't always happen right away. It doesn't happen every single time. People, especially people who are not Lubavitch, they're not coming again and again and again and again if, in their language, mis nicht geholfen geworden. If they were not helped. The oil works. That's why people come. So I said to these men and women, I said, you're all here. And you're here because you believe that this is a living place. And over here you can get coming geholfen werden. I just want to say a simple thing. I told them. I said, all of you have your list of interests and needs and desires and priorities. And some of them are probably very, very real. I just want to say a simple thing to you. You're all coming here what you need from the Rebbe. What does the Rebbe want from you? He simply wants you to be a little bit more conscientious as a Jew. Davening, a little more kavanah. A Shabbos meal shouldn't be like Esav. Should feel like a Shabbos meal, and it should look like a Shabbos meal, and it sounds like a Shabbos meal, and it should be. That's all he wants. The Rebbe wants us to be better Yidden. We should daven better, we should learn better, we should refine our character more. The Rebbe simply wants us to be better Jews. And all of us run to the oil for everything. And on a day like today, and you were by the oil already, and you go to the oil and everybody has their issues and their needs and their wants and their desires. One of the things that should be a part of our relationship with the Rebbe is, in what way am I going to be a better Jew because I have this relationship? And it's very important to include this in the paradigm of our Chassidus. The Rebbe is the Rebbe. And we're very happy to be his Chassidim. And we try our best to do what Chassidim need to do. We need to appreciate that he gives so much. He really does. Today, always. And what he wants is that we should allow ourselves to be a little bit more earnest and sincere and dedicated and hardworking and committed to Yiddishkeit. That's all. So Hashem should bless us all. We should have a successful Yud Shvat, and they should have ripples al kol Hashanah kula. And each person should find in himself the ability to be a chassid. I spoke today for the girls, and I got into a big argument with the girls. It was very interesting. And I said the worst thing a person can do is be an ambivalent chassid. I'm a chassid of the Rebbe, but I'm angry about it. Why do I have to be in? It's after Gimel Tammuz, and I get this complaint and this complaint. If you're going to do it, do it joyously. To do it and be miserable, it's like, as the Gemara says, Kereich mikan, Kereich mikan, right? Your young wife pulls out your white hair, your old wife pulls out your black hair, and you have no hair at all. You want to be a chassid b'simcha. Okay, l'chaim. Stop in mind of.